We have Gale Massey here tonight. Hello, thank you for being here and welcome to Jacksonville. Thank you. Massey's novel, The Girl from Blind River, received a 2018 Florida Book Award and was a finalist for the Clara Johnson Award. In Massey's most recent book, Rising in Other Stories, she focuses on the lives of women overcoming obstacles. Her work has been featured in several publications, including Lambda Literary, CrimeReads, and Tampa Bay Times, along with many others. Gale was a Tennessee Williams Scholar at the Sewanee Writers Conference and a fellow at Writers in Paradise. And she also served as a panel judge for the Lambda Literary Awards. She has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize in both fiction and nonfiction, and she currently lives in St. Petersburg, Florida. And Gale is working on her second novel, so we'll be excited to see when that comes out. I also want to introduce our moderator, Trisha Booker. Woo! Thank you for being here. Booker is an award-winning journalist, a writer of creative nonfiction, and a writing educator. She teaches journalism at the University of North Florida, and Booker is the award-winning author of the memoir, The Place of Peace and Crickets, How Adoption, Heartache, and Love Built a Family. She lives in Ponte Vedra with her family. Thank you so much for being here tonight. And let's get started.
Thank you so much, Imani, and thank you very much to Pablo Creek Library for having us. Really excited to be here. I met Gale years ago at a weekend writers workshop and conference in Cedar Key, and I think we first bonded over our mutual wildly inappropriate sense of humor, but we soon also bonded over our love of writing about underdogs and reading about the disenfranchised and the stories behind the stories. Gale is one of the few writers who whenever I read, I am continually surprised by. I mean, her writing, her characters surprise me. You don't read her writing without occasionally having to put the book down and think about what you've just absorbed. If you've read The Rising, you know that at least once in the book you're going to say, "You killed her?" It is just one of those books that just grabs you by the heart. So I'm really happy to be here interviewing her and talking about her work. I thought maybe we would start with having her tell us about how she became a writer, when she first started to write, and when she knew that writing would be a part of her life forever.
I didn't really know that writing would be a part of my life, a big part of my life, until right about the time I met you. I started writing a little bit when I was a teenager. I was writing poems and trying to figure out what the meaning of life was and why I was here. And then I journaled for a while. I journaled in my 20s. And then somewhere in my late 20s, I had a bonfire and burned all of that. Burned the journals and the poetry. It made sense to me to do that at that point, so that's what I did. And I wrote some in my 40s, and I wrote a small booklet that's titled Grief Reminders for Healing, and that got circulated around a lot in the hospice industry. And that was the first time that I thought, well, maybe I do have something to say. Something of value, and I started to take fiction writing seriously in my 40s, and then I started really trying to understand the craft when I turned about 50. So since then, I've written a lot of short stories. I collected them in this book, Rising, that Bronzeville Books was happy enough to publish earlier. Well, I guess it was last year. Yeah. And I wrote The Girl from Blind River, which someone right here just happens to have a copy of, is reading for the first time. I really appreciate that. So I think it was when that book came out that I really kind of decided that I did have a unique voice and a unique perspective on the world, and I should, devote more of my time and energy to that. It's been gratifying. I'm glad I finally made that choice. Kind of late, but I'm here.
We're so glad for that. Is that about the time when you started identifying yourself as a writer?
Yeah, I would say for me, I needed to see that book get published before I really started identifying as a writer. But that's been a really gradual process for me. I needed a lot of external validation for that, but now that validation is coming from within me. I actually see myself as an artist that needs to express, and this is my format for doing that.
That's wonderful to hear, but I think that's kind of a societal problem, isn't it? That as artists, we don't think of ourselves as artists unless we get that external validation. Like saying that you're a writer is kind of like saying you're unemployed, right? So it's wonderful to hear that you're starting to think of yourself as a writer independently of your successes or non-successes.
I think it is. It's really a challenge. I wasn't even willing to admit that I was an artist. I didn't even see writing as art for a long time, and it is so externally motivated. If you're writing, you necessarily need to be read in order for that conversation to find its natural loop. So if that's not happening, and I really identify with that struggle. I think a lot of people want to be writers, and they want to contribute to the conversation that we're having through publishing. And it's frustrating not to be getting published when you are a writer, and then when that loop starts to get completed, you get enough affirmation, and that door is open to you.
Yeah, I mean, I was on the Today Show yesterday. Jamie Lynn Spears, Britney Spears' daughter, has a book out that I'm sure is going to be on the bestseller list, and that I won't read. But it's hard. I mean, there's these celebrity writers who are not writers, and when you are a writer, sometimes that can be frustrating. Although I'm happy for Jamie Lynn. I want to read you something that Gale, we wrote back and forth about different things that we could talk about today, and she wrote something that I found really interesting. She said, "I try and find the universal thread of being a woman, having been raised in a patriarchy. I don't write stories about families, marriages, raising children, and the challenges cis women have today. I write about oppression, impoverished lives, grief, the impact of poverty on families." And I kind of pushed back on that because, of course, she does write about families. She doesn't write about normative families who are having breakfast every Sunday morning at the Waffle House and who are taking their Easter pictures. She writes about families that are perhaps fractured or families that aren't working. And I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about your inspiration for some of the families that are woven together. For example, the girl from Blind River, that may not be a perfect family, but it is a family. I mean, you have these people together who are cohabitating in this trailer, and for better or for worse, mostly for worse, they are a family.
Yeah, I think I'm really interested in the impact of poverty on families, not the whitewashed version of mothers who are working 2 or 3 jobs and raising their kids as a solo parent, and everybody makes it out alive. I think that there are very real economic impacts on families when they are impoverished, and that really limits the choices that that kids have and the support systems that they have to rise above their economic circumstances as when they get to be adults.
So the families that you pull together, do you see them as ways for people who, like people in need or economically disadvantaged people, as a way for them to just kind of get through, a way for them to just sort of make it? Like they're the only connections that they have, so they have to make it work. Is that kind of the way you see their relationships, even the bad ones?
Sure.
Okay. For example, the relationship that Toby has with his uncle, who he lives with, is that something that why do you feel that's important to portray? Kind of the pluses and like the positives and the negatives of that relationship. Is that something that you think is going to affect who he is for the rest of his life? I mean, what are you trying to tell us through that?
I think I'm trying to take a close look at the limited choices that people have when they are really just struggling to put food on the table or keep the kids clothed.
That leads me to my next question, which is some of these situations. Your book has been described, particularly The Rising, has been described as a way to portray women who are overcoming circumstances. But a lot of these women are not overcoming their circumstances. A lot of them are mired in their circumstances, and they're just stuck there. And when you finish the story, you're like, damn, I mean, that sucks, you know? I wondered if you ever felt pressure from publishers or perhaps just from your readers to create the happy ending.
I felt pressure, internal pressure to create happy endings. And so a lot of my stories just went into a drawer because I couldn't really come up with happy endings. That's not really who I am. So the pressure to make happy endings was really inside of me once I accepted that I could make a story end any way I wanted to. I think my voice started coming through more than because I didn't really see the point of writing happy endings. I don't think that's necessarily what we are all living with. Life is, it never really turns out exactly the way you think it might. Every episode in your life, you think you know where you're headed, and there's always a twist. It's just like never really exactly what you thought was going to happen. So I like the more realistic endings because I think they're more true to my life experience, and I think they're more true to most people's life experiences.
Your fiction draws heavily on your childhood. I know it did in the beginning. Does it continue to influence your writing, your childhood, and your upbringing?
It has up until now. The work I'm doing right now in a novel that I'm writing has more to do with intergenerational family dynamics. I think I've said quite a lot about poverty and the impact that it has on families, and in particular on the relationship between the mother and the child. What I'm looking at now is actually about intergenerational homophobia and how that gets portrayed or played out in families, because I'm very interested in how gay people lose their history through homophobia. If you have a family, I know we're kind of a little bit off track here, but this is really interesting to me and where my work is right now. If you have a family that's constantly putting their gay relatives in the closet and disappearing them, you're taking away the social structure for a gay person to know who they are as they're growing up. And that's what my next novel is about. I just realized recently, within the last couple of years, that I have gay ancestors that I knew nothing about. And that could have been so powerful to me to know that 3 generations ago I had a gay senator in my family. Or 2 generations back, I had a professor at Indiana State University who taught English, and she wrote a book of poetry, and she had a lifelong partner. These things weren't shared with me as I was coming out, as I was beginning to understand who I am. And I think that was a real loss. And I think I would like to talk about, in my next book, I would like to talk about what can be gained from not putting people in the closet and not telling the next generation about their ancestors.
So you're talking a lot about censoring relatives in the past, but that continues to be an issue today. And you have experienced censorship with your work. Is that right? With my work? With your book. Did you have a situation in which...
Oh, I did, yeah. That's true. I had a situation with the Catholic diocese in St. Petersburg.
Diocese. Yeah.
Diocese. Yeah. I'm not Catholic.
No.
So I didn't.
I'm a recovering Catholic.
Good for you. Yeah, they had me scheduled to come speak to their middle grade class. And when they found out that I was an out gay woman, they canceled my appearance, and we went round and around about it. But in the end, I was disinvited.
Is writing about being gay just as important, and the challenges that gay people face, is that just as important to you as writing about oppression and poverty, because it's pushing it into people's faces and saying, look, this is real.
Yeah, it's that important to me. It's when you want to write and you're involved in projects, if you don't have a heartfelt connection to the work, it's gonna fizzle out. So you really, for me, I have to find exactly what empowers the work itself, and that is passion. So I have a lot of passion for whatever it is I'm writing about, or I know I'm not going to make it to the end of the project. I'm gonna lose my love for it. So for me, a project has to have the legs to go the distance, but I have to have the passion for the topic.
Okay. Your books probably aren't going to be turned into Hallmark movies. Probably not.
Probably not.
In your the story, you have one story in Rising, and I forget the name, but about a woman whose son, young son, 7 or 9 years old, finds a gun. What is the name? Racine story, yeah. And it's a story that's all too familiar for us, especially here in Florida. We are having more and more incidences of children who find guns and bad things happen. I wonder if that story in particular was inspired by something that you read or a story that you saw, or some things that have been happening around the country regarding firearms.
Yeah, I started that story when I lived in Atlanta, and there's a town just north of Atlanta where it was a county law that every household had to have a gun. And it was passed when I lived in Atlanta, maybe 20, 25 years ago. And I thought, that's the most ridiculous law I've ever heard of, being a pacifist. I don't know guns, and I can't imagine every house needing to have a gun, or why. And I thought, well, what could go wrong there? And that's where that story came out of. And for me too, every story begins with a character, and my mind went to, what does the mother of that child, what is her story? What does that look like? How tragic is that for her?
That's neat. Is that mostly how your characters come into your head? You read something or you see something and you wonder?
Yeah, my stories always start with character, and I just spend some time with that character. Most people find trouble pretty quick and easy. So if you're getting into a character's head, just give it a little while. I think you're going to find some trouble. And trouble is the thing you want to write about, I think.
Oh, yeah. That's best part to read about, too. Yeah. I know you're working on a novel right now. What are some of your reading, your reading habits while you're writing? Like, are there things that you avoid reading while you're writing because you don't want it to influence your work? Or does it not matter?
It does matter to me. A lot of writers, I think, sit down with a certain level of self-esteem and voices in your head that tell you you can do something or cannot do something. And when I'm really reading really fine literature, then when I sit down to write it, I get stuck because no first draft is ever that pretty. So I try not to read really great stuff while I'm writing, so that I can kind of keep that voice at bay, because I know I have to get 2 and 3 drafts into a story before it's going to have any of the beauty that I see in my head. You know, the trick is you see something beautiful in your head and you have to bring it through your brain stem and out your fingertips and make little black marks on paper. That's a trick. That's alchemy to me, to successfully do that. And it takes a lot of patience. So I like to read really great literature when I'm between projects. Otherwise, I find myself being a little too harsh when I'm at the keyboard.
And what are your writing habits when you are in the middle of something? Do you write for a certain number of hours, or do you go by pages, or is it just kind of at your whim?
It used to be at my whim, but I've learned a lot of discipline in the last 3 or 4 months. And I get up every day, even like 6 days a week, maybe sometimes 7 days a week. And I just get into the world and get into not into the world, but into my day. And I sit down and I write for at least an hour. And then I find that time is really lengthening now. I'm writing for a couple of hours. And when my body turns like to concrete and I can hardly move, then I get up and I spend 2 or 3 or 4 hours doing other things, moving my body and taking care of, the grocery list and laundry. And then I go back in the afternoon for a second session, and that usually lasts 1 to 3 hours too. And that has really, it's been amazing for me. I wrote the first draft of my current novel in 3 months doing that. And I've never, ever written that much in a short period of time before. So it's been very valuable to learn a little bit of discipline. It's helped me incredibly. It used to be that I would write when I felt inspired. And I didn't always feel inspired. I didn't feel inspired a lot of the time. But now I have a project that I have a lot of passion for, and it calls me to it. And that's like the most beautiful place you can be as a writer, is when your work is calling you to come and spend time with it. So I'm a very happy camper right now.
That's awesome. I also find that writing is a habit that you have to practice, kind of like if you're a basketball player and you go 3 months without shooting a basket, you can't just go out onto the court. You've got to get back into the routine of it before it feels comfortable to sit down every day, when you don't get sore, So it becomes a habit, and once it becomes a habit, then it calls you. Yeah,
that's definitely true. You can lose the practice of it kind of easily, and you can also get it back a little bit easily too. If you just stick with it for a week or so, you'll be back in the practice of creating sentences. And yeah,
most of your work is set in times past, like pre-iPad. I wonder if that has to do with setting your stories at a time that's closer to your childhood, to when you were growing up or when you were a young adult. If that's a choice you made, or if the stories just come to you in that time period. Because most of them are like in the 70s, 80s set, or earlier.
Well, Blind River was set in 2011. 2011.
Okay.
I think
I
too.
forgot. She did have an iPhone. I remember now.
That's right. Yeah, she threw it in the river.
Yeah.
Which is just a fantasy I have of throwing my phone in the river. It turns up in a lot of my stories that the main character throws their phone in the river. And some of it, too, is that if I'm writing about a family that doesn't have a lot of money, they don't have a lot of devices. And they may not have broadband or service.
I had not thought of that. Thank you. Tell me a little bit about your novel, if you feel comfortable with it, the novel that you're working on now.
The novel I'm working on now is not exactly a sequel to The Girl from Blind River, but it sort of is. It's I like the idea of taking the characters that I love a great deal and writing a novel from their point of view. So I have a family. They're the Elders family. And Jamie Elders is the protagonist in The Girl from Blind River. And the book I'm working on now, her brother is the protagonist. I don't have a title for it yet.
I love that concept because we all have different memories from a same time period. I mean, if you're in a family, you have argued many times with your siblings or parents about how something really happened. I have a sister who swears she broke her leg growing up, and we all know that she didn't. But I love the idea of telling the same story from a different perspective. It really shows how differently people remember things and how differently things affect people.
Two of my favorite authors do that, Marilyn Robinson and Elizabeth Strout. And they'll dedicate an entire novel to one character that was a minor character in their previous novel. And I love that. It gives so much context to the reader. And yeah, it's telling the same story from a different point of view, which I have 3 sisters, and I think you have 3 sisters. Yeah. We all have various memories of how our childhood was. I don't even write about my sisters and because my memories are so different from them, and because they would probably kill me if I did.
I do write about it, and my memories are mostly right, and theirs are wrong. They could try to kill me, but they couldn't. I'm very strong. Tell us a little bit about getting yourself in the head of a young man, because Toby's a man, and you're writing from his perspective. How did you get yourself into his head?
I started writing about Toby when he was 17, and I had no issues putting myself in his shoes. And now in this book, he's 25, and I think that so many of the dynamics that exist in the Elders family between Toby and his uncle and Toby and his sister, all of those things I draw from my own emotional life. They're not biographical, but the emotional content is within me. That's where the story is coming from. I'm just dressing it completely differently. But I don't have any trouble. I don't feel like I'm having any trouble understanding Toby. I think the main thing is to really love the character. And I love him. I have always loved him from the moment I started writing his character. I loved him. I love his uncle, who is not a nice man, but I love him. I have a deep love for these characters. So there's no problem slipping inside their head. I'm actually very comfortable when I'm writing these particular people. I'm not really sure why that is, but it is sort of my happy place. I like these people, even though they're not like people you would necessarily want to live next door to. But I find them fascinating. I find their emotional lives compelling to tell.
What I find really fascinating about that is that we are living in a time of for many reasons, but mainly because of the pandemic, of great disconnection. And there's so much hate and so much divisiveness between people. And you are looking at people who, if you met in real life, you might, if I met in real life, I might be like, no, I'm not going to have a beer with you. But you're looking at them and seeing, okay, yeah, he's got a lot of problems, but he's got some attributes too. Do you see that as a way to help you kind of make sense of the disconnectedness in the world? Or does it help you make sense?
Does it help me make sense of the disconnectedness in the world?
Well, that's kind of a complicated question. Let me ask you this. Does it help you be less judgmental, to kind of put yourself in somebody else's shoes, less judgmental about people who you might otherwise have opinions about?
Yeah, totally. I understand your question now. I think empathy is the entire point of telling stories and creating a broader first impression of someone you might come across on the street. Instead of judging them automatically for having too many kids or not having, the right clothing. When you're a writer, well, for me, I feel like there's an infinite number of reasons someone is in the situation they're in, and I'm not the one to judge that, because I've been in very difficult situations myself, and I've made difficult and bad choices. So I bring that to writing about the characters that I love. So I think it does make me more empathetic the more I try to tell these stories. I think that is me growing empathetically, if that's a word.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I think we're almost to the question portion, but I was thinking that if you all are okay with it, we would have Gale read a short excerpt from one of her stories. Okay? This is a story, let's see. I think it's Racine that I wanted you to read from, right? No, it's Lucky Girl. That's right. All right. This is a story called Lucky Girl.
On that last morning, I headed toward the deserted bright beach south of my shack. The sun was high overhead, sitting alone in a vacant sky. I hated to think of its isolation, how lonely it must be as it trudged overhead day after day, cursed with a timeless existence. A small breeze licked at the sweat beads popping up along my upper lip as I walked. The summer had been hot and relentless. Every night I dreamed of him, as though the dreams would keep him alive, but the dreams were just always more goodbyes, though they always felt as real as that last day. His hand letting go of mine, the skin on his fingers transparent and wasted, the bones so shrunken they could no longer hold his wedding band. But it wasn't really a dream. It was a memory I fell prey to whenever I fell asleep. Every morning when the dream ended, I woke with grief sitting like a heat wave behind my eyes. The roped bridge connecting the mainland to the island swayed beneath my feet when I passed over the water. The horizon tilted one way, then another. I kept walking toward the stinging salt water that I would dive into, hoping to cleanse myself of the memory. Dreams restored the dead, but never fully. One minute they are gone, the next they are back. Sleep was nothing more than a groundhog's day for the living, a nightly boomerang. In the morning, when the grief returned, and it always did, it slammed like the wind.
Beautiful. Thank you. Those descriptions are just lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do we have some questions? So I think your question is about family dynamics, and how do you bring in all the baggage that each character brings to a relationship? As a writer, how do you tackle that? Because sometimes you're focusing on one particular character, but these dynamics depend on the history of these other characters as well. Do you feel an obligation to do that? And what problem are you trying to solve by creating some kind of conflict within that dynamic?
So basically, I'm trying to tell a story that touches on the human experience, which is the universal human experience. And when I'm telling a story, when I'm writing, I see characters as basically coming to each other wanting something from the other. My characters are always trying to manipulate or get something or win something or get their point of view across. So to me, characters in a story are really just trying to get something from each other. And that's what motivates dialogue, and that's what motivates the dynamics within the story.
I love that the characterization of your characters, that every character wants something, and for you to figure out what it is and to expose that.
Yeah,
that's awesome. Thank you. I think you search for truth in families, but many families have a gatekeeper that stops truth. Is this represented in your writings? That's a great question.
A gatekeeper that stops truth. Wow, that is a great question. I think it's a dynamic. Families can dance around questions or issues, and they might dance toward the flame a little bit, but I think families they don't know when to pull back, but I think it's sort of an organic thing. Like, we're gonna get this close to it, but if it starts to damage our sense of self or our sense of how we see our family, we're gonna pull back. And it could be one person in the family that says, no, we're not gonna go there anymore. Or it could be just the family dynamic trying to keep the image of the family alive, because I know in my family we have a certain, each of my sisters has a certain sort of view and perspective of our family, and it's different from between all of us. So I think it's organic in a way, but you can also have, yes, one person who's like the historian, who keeps all the family photographs, who will keep you either going toward that truth or shut the door, slam the door on it.
You also, I was just thinking about your final story in Rising about Elise. Elise is kind of her own gatekeeper to the truth. She's kind of barring her own truth from coming out, and you kind of see that through the story. So that's a good question. That's very thoughtful. Thank you, Imani. This is a great question. How many drafts of The Girl from Blind River did you write before you decided it was ready to publish? Let me just answer first and say you never think you're ready to publish, but that's a great question. How many drafts do you think you went through?
I don't know how many drafts I went through, but I wish I had gone through about 2 or 3 more. And in fact, I would like to just, give that book another shot. I'd love to write it again. But let's see, basically probably, I would say 15 or 16. And I think it really could have used a few more.
Anne Lamott, the writer Anne Lamott, who's one of my favorites, said, never be afraid of the crappy. She didn't use the word crappy. She used another word, but she said, never be afraid of the crappy first draft, because you got to get started somewhere.
Yes. The first draft is often painful to go back and read. And like Connie Mae Fowler says, you have to have just a lot of self-forgiveness to go back into that and see what mess you've made, but you've generated a story with dynamics and an arc and characters that are playing off of each other. So you have to give yourself a lot of credit and a lot of generosity to get back in and do the hard work of revision. But also the joyful work of revision.
Yeah, there is reward in it. This is a good question. As a Southern writer, why did you base your first book in New York?
So that's a complicated question, but the basic answer to that is that when I was first writing the book, I had images of ice and sleet and snow. And the character, Jamie Elders, is living in deprivation. And I wanted to stay true to the original images that were coming to me. And I also wanted to put her in situations where she was seeking comfort. She was always seeking to get out of the cold and to find warm places where she could spend the night. She was never very comfortable. And the cold winter of New York lent itself to that, to keeping true to that. And I had also spent a summer in New York, and I knew this little town where I thought the novel could be played out.
One of the things that Jamie takes comfort in is gambling, cards, playing cards. I think she is the first character in a book that has been so enamored with cards. How did you come upon that as a thing? Is that something that you had personal experience with, or is it just something you became fascinated with?
I started learning to play poker right about the same time I was really learning about novel structure, and I thought that poker could be a great vehicle to tell an entire story. And then when I was playing poker, I met a young woman who was such an extraordinary player, and she was only 18 or 19 years old. And I wondered, my question was, how does someone that age get to be so good at poker? And then from there, I came across, I built this family that was their pastime. They played poker, and that's how she got to be so good. And that's how she got to be a champion, was playing poker from a very young age with her parents at the kitchen table.
That was a really interesting aspect of that story, and I learned a lot about poker. I didn't know anything about poker, but I loved that you based the story around this topic that not a lot of people know about. How do you think your writing has changed over time, besides improving? Do you think you've changed your approach to it, or do you think you have changed your I don't know. How do you think it's changed?
I think with the publication of some stories and the novel, my confidence has grown. So I'm not as blocked when I sit down to write. I feel like I have some skill to bring to the table, and that has helped me in so many ways. So once you get some publications going, it becomes a good feedback loop. You feel like your voice is getting stronger. So I would just say over the years, I've increased my skill set quite a lot with the conferences and workshops that I've gone to, and then just from there building confidence. So I think when I sit down to write now, I just don't have as much self-doubt.
Do you think when you have that, when you've built up that confidence, you also are willing to take more risks with your writing?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. More risks with the writing. That's a fine line, and staying true to the story and taking more risks. Sometimes I feel like I want to get out more and take more risks, but I kind of don't really. I don't, because I don't think I'm there quite yet.
That's a great answer. I love this question. How does the place we live in Florida influence your stories? Does your place become a character of its own in some of them? I love this because you do portray Florida just so descriptively, and I mean, you can just feel yourself sometimes in the places that you describe, especially in the wild. So I would love to hear the answer to that. How does Florida influence your stories, and about how you make Florida and the setting almost another character in your stories?
So I grew up in Florida. I'm a 7th generation Floridian, and I draw a lot of comfort from nature. I always have. As a little kid, I would be in any body of water that my mother allowed me to go into, that, weren't alligator infested. So a lot of my stories are set here because that's when I'm writing, that's what I want to feel around me. So that's why some of my stories are set on rivers or in the Gulf. It's another character at times because it's so important to me, and I want to try now and then to provide that same comfort to the reader, because that's really where I draw so much strength and solace.
That's beautiful, and I do think sometimes in your stories, which can become so heavy with trauma, that the place does become a comfort. Like you can, there can be great beauty in great sadness, I think is how I would describe some of your stories. Would you agree with that? That you can find some great beauty in some of the terrible things that happen?
Yeah, I think that's what I did as a child, was to focus on crickets in a field. That there was a field by my house, and I went there to see the sunset almost every day for one season, and the crickets would be there jumping around in the grasses. One of my lasting memories of my father, who died when I was very young, was on the Weeki Wachee River, and that's why Swim Away is set on the Weeki Wachee. So it's me drawing comfort from where I drew comfort from when I was little. It's just
and I see pictures of you continuing to visit the Weeki Wachee River.
Yeah, I love it there.
Which is very cool. Yeah. I love that writers like you and Connie Mae Fowler portray a Florida, the Florida that many of us know and love, and not the Florida with mouse ears that the rest of the country sees. There's so much to this state, I think, that the rest of the country doesn't see.
I totally agree with that. And one of the reasons I didn't set Blind River here, everything I said earlier is absolutely true, but I didn't really know how to write about Florida at that point in time that wasn't sort of campy and hokey, and I didn't want to add to that body of literature that exists. I appreciate Connie Mae Fowler's work more, because I don't want to write about mouse ears and the crazy things that happen here. That's not Florida to me. That's a shtick.
You've talked about writing about intergenerational homophobia, and you continue to do that well. Do you plan on exploring other intergenerational dynamics such as racism, misogyny, etc.? I think you tackle misogyny quite a bit in your work, and racism more tangentially. Is that something that you set out to do, or is it something that just begins to happen to the characters?
I don't plan I do talk a lot about misogyny and growing up in a patriarchal, oppressive world. I was raised as a Baptist, and all original sin is the fault of the woman. And I rebelled against that immediately just as a child. I just couldn't see the logic there. I wrote about racism in the first story called Glass, and that was really an exploration of mine to go back into my childhood and try and see where I got my attitudes of distancing from people that were different from me. That was more of an exploration for me, and I don't know if I'll be doing more of that. It's not on my agenda at the moment.
Great. What writers have influenced you the most as a writer? And I know that as both a reader and a writer, that those answers can be different. You have writers that you love, but then writers that influence you. Who do you think has influenced your writing?
Well, like I said, Elizabeth Strout has, sort of like allowed me to just, write more about each of the characters that appear in the first novel. I have been asked this question before, and I really just don't have a great response to it. I read a lot of debut novels because I feel like debut novels have been worked over quite a lot. And it is the essence at times of what that person wants to say to the world. And I find that debut novels are really sometimes just where it's at. So I don't have a list of them.
I get asked that a lot as well, and I find that the writers that influence me change. It depends on what I'm reading, because I'm always reading different stuff and new, great stuff. Maybe can you think of one of the first books that you read as a young woman where you thought, wow, this is making me think, or this is changing how I think, this is what I want to do?
Well, I mean, how many times can I say Connie May Fowler in one session? But her book, Before Women Had Wings, showed me a story of myself, and made me aware that I could be represented in literature. That my stories as a poor young white girl growing up in the 60s and 70s, that story was valid too. And I didn't know that before then. So that book probably had the most impact on me than any other book has ever had. I've read a lot of books since then that validated that, but that was the first time that I saw myself in a book. And I think that's the most powerful experience a writer or a human can have, is to see themselves portrayed in a book or a movie or somewhere in the media.
That's really something, to think that you read that book and recognized your story and said, wow, I have something to say, and there are people who will listen to it. That's great. Do you think that in order for someone to see beauty in a traumatic experience, it means that there is a unique understanding of trauma? Are there personal examples you care to speak of? Well, you just talked about the crickets and seeing the crickets when you were going through a very difficult time. Are there other examples you can think of when you saw beauty in something terrible that was happening?
Yeah, that's. I think beauty has to take you off guard, and you collect those memories in your heart. I don't have an example other than the crickets, but I think if you're going through grief, and all of us will or do, and beauty sneaks up on you, that it's a healing moment, and it can happen at any time. But I'm not thinking of a trauma that I saw beauty in. I'm not seeing it that way.
Perhaps on a daily basis, we all do that. We are living in a difficult time, but we're seeing beauty in these difficult days. We're seeing beauty in increased appreciation of family, or perhaps we're slowing down. Perhaps that's all kind of a symbol of our ability to see two opposing natures at once.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I like the way you put that. This is a really difficult time, and I think books are really providing so much comfort because we're so isolated. Curling up with a good book and hiding away from the world it seems like a really good idea these days.
Are you able to separate yourself pretty well from social media? Are you on social media? Are you off it? Do you find yourself having a difficult time staying away from it?
I had a realization a couple of months ago that social media was actually bringing me more pain than I wanted. And so I got off Twitter, and I just check in randomly throughout the day a couple of times, but I limit that to Facebook and sometimes I scroll through Instagram. But I think it's not a happy place for me, and it doesn't make sense to keep going there. I recognized at some point that I was scrolling through Instagram until I felt bad. And then I would log out of it. And then like a few hours later, I would go back to it and I would do the same thing. And I've just had an enlightened moment where I thought, this is a ridiculous thing for me to do with my time and energy. And it doesn't make me feel good. So that's where I stand on that.
It's like a friend you can't quite ditch. Yeah. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much, Gale. Imani, did you have some closing?
Could I just say thanks to everybody for showing up tonight, and thank you to the library for having me. I really appreciate being here. And thank you, Tricia Booker. You're wonderful to talk with.
Oh, thank you. It was great to be here with you.